part because I'm deeper down in the trenches than I think any of my esteemed colleagues here, and partly because Berkeley is, I want to say, a uniquely privileged public university, and I think that needs to be acknowledged. I think Doug's point about the differences in universities and public universities is important, and we came, I think, into this current conjuncture in a better position than many of other universities. I hope maybe I can sketch out the way in which we're trying to address the situation and raise some of what I think of as the identity issues that are raised by the fiscal crisis. So there are two components of my talk. The first part is about the fiscal crisis in Berkeley, in the terms of Berkeley, and the second part is on some of the large identity crisis issues that it raises for public education in general. I mean, we all know about the progressive divestment of state governments in public education in the University of California, Berkeley, that in 1978, the state contributed about 58% of our budget, and today it's closer to about somewhere between 21 and 25% of our budget. The other 20% comes from federal research money, but roughly. We're now closing in on 20% of that also coming from the private, not just sector, not just endowment, but also private grants and contracts. We, like everybody else, are facing a serious structural budget crisis. At Berkeley, it's a $150 million annual structural budget gap, which is likely, I think, to increase. I don't think the news at Berkeley is going to be any better in the coming year, or in the next couple of years. I think the June budget that revised that we'll probably hear is going to make things even more challenging for us. Now, that said, I want to say, you know, it's partly also for Berkeley a crisis of comparison, and because Berkeley likes to compare itself with places like Harvard and places like Princeton. And if we do that, I think Berkeley looks pretty good, and it's worth doing every once in a while just to cheer ourselves up a bit. Because, you know, Berkeley teaches 4 times the number of undergraduates that Harvard does. It has 1/10 of the endowment, and it teaches those 4 times the number of students with about 1/2 the annual revenue of Harvard. And we're in the dead heat in every national and international ranking. Now, and I don't say that just to brag, actually, about Berkeley, although I think in terms of public relations, we could do a lot more bragging to the taxpayers, both the state and the nation, about what a good job, actually, public education does. I say that because Berkeley has always, in some weird way, defied the numbers. There was a famous meeting of chief financial officers of the major research universities at Stanford about 5 or 10 years ago. And they said, well, you know, you pretty much graph the wealth of an institution and its ranking, except when there's this one, you know, institution out here, it's Berkeley. And what does that tell us? Not that Berkeley's so great, but that actually you don't need that much money to be a great university. The privates are doing lots of things that public universities both don't do and don't need to do. And the first thing they don't need to do is to be major patrons of the arts and letters in the way at the level and capacity of the Medici during the Renaissance. So we're never at Berkeley going to be bringing Toni Morrison for a lecture for $25,000. We will never be financing museums like the Fogg Museum, and I think I want to come back to that in terms of our core mission. Our ambitions are always going to be differently defined because of our public character. We will never at Berkeley have a medical school. We will have to continue to focus, I think, increasingly on our core missions, research and instruction. So how are we going to close this $150 million budget gap? I think there's no one magic bullet, obviously, and many of the elements of that have been mentioned, although one that we're engaging in intensively at Berkeley right now, operational excellence, is reducing administrative costs. It's absolutely critical to our success in getting through this crisis that we become more administratively efficient, and it's you know, not a fun thing to do, but it's essential, and we're going to increase our endowment. We're 2/3 of the way through a $3 billion capital campaign, and I'm proud to say we're on track to succeeding with that campaign. So, report from the trenches, Bob. We're going to increase fees, and we're going to increase the percentage of out-of-state students. As was mentioned, Berkeley, unlike Michigan, is a very low level of out-of-state students, only 11% at Berkeley. We're hoping to be able to increase that to somewhere around 20%. Most members of the faculty and the higher administration would think it imprudent to go further than that. And I'll come back to why in a minute. I want to say about federal research dollars, and I'd be interested in Roger's reaction to this. Our sense about that is that it's sort of a mixed blessing. Federal research dollars are not necessarily a net gift in relation to state funding. There's, the indirect costs of federal research grants to universities is in effect a net subsidy of the social and human sciences to the hard sciences at the University of California. And I think that's something we haven't spoken about enough, and I think would be an interesting thing to come back to in conversation. So at Berkeley, we're thinking that fiscal diversification is not quite the same thing as privatization. And we're trying to develop at least 4 funding streams rather than 1 revenue stream in terms of thinking toward a mixed model for a sustainable future. Public funding has to be a central component of that, and I'll come back to why in a minute, in part because it ensures our accountability to both the government and citizens, as well as to the stability, I think, of our teaching mission and our ability to deliver that teaching mission. Revenue generation, I think, is another important component, and I don't think of it necessarily as undermining our public character. It rather could be understood positively. I'm going to give the Pollyanna talk. As a means of increasing our engagement with a great number of sectors in both the society and the economy. I think if we're going to demonstrate the relevance of our institutions, particularly their research mission, this is not something that we should turn our noses at.